Today, I want us to try to connect the small, minor details of life with the great, big, largest conflict in the universe. That's what I want to do. I want us to see that this great controversy between good and evil impacts our very beings in the very most basic parts of our existence. So let's just, without further ado, go into the book of Daniel and take a look at it, all right? I decided I had so much fun with Daniel 3 that I was going to spend a little more time in Daniel with you. And so I want to go to Daniel 1. We'll pick up a couple of chapters that we missed. We won't pick them both up today, but at least the first chapter. Chapter 1, and I brought with me the New King James in case you're wondering if it reads a little differently than what I normally read up here, which is the NIV. But I chose the New King James because it has some wording, I think, that's a little more accurate in this story, and to help us learn a few lessons, draw a few parallels. So Daniel chapter 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Now, from a worldly point of view, this was simply one of the, probably the greatest king of one of the more short-lived empires of the world, really, coming and dealing with a minor Middle Eastern power and subjugating them. But from the biblical viewpoint, there's a whole lot more to the story. What are the two major players that we already see in verse 1? All right. The people are Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim, which stand for what empires? What kingdoms? We have the kingdom of Babylon and the kingdom of Judah. What are the cities? The city of Babylon and the city of Jerusalem. And already, for the alert biblical student, already we're thrown into a cosmic connection here. And I want to show you why. Where do we first find the identity of the ultimate evil personality? What biblical text do we go to find his original name? Do you remember? By the way, what was his name as an angel? Lucifer, the one who carries the light of God, of course. And we find that in Isaiah, the 14th chapter. So turn with me there, and I want you to notice the context where we find his identification. Isaiah 14, you'll find his name, Lucifer, mentioned in verse 12. But back in verse 4, we find the context for the statements of Lucifer. And the context in verse 4, Isaiah is commanded by the Lord to take up this proverb against whom? The king of Babylon. And it's as he is speaking against the king of Babylon that the prophet of God draws aside the veil. Just like Jesus did with Peter. Remember that time Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me," who? Satan. He drew aside the veil, remember? And spoke to the one who was instigating it all. And so Isaiah does that same thing that Jesus later was to do with Peter. And Isaiah draws aside the veil and he speaks to the power behind the king of Babylon, Lucifer. And what was Lucifer's greatest goal? Verse 14. His greatest goal, the last line of verse 14. I will be what? Like the Most High. And so, from the time we first come across the forerunning portion of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, remember? Back in Genesis 11, where the people have a stated purpose that they're going to build a tower that reaches to the heavens, and we will make a name for ourselves. We recognize that Babylon is at war against the God of heaven. And Babylon's purpose is to usurp the prerogatives and the power and the position of God. Babylon is the personification of the great conflict against God and His way and His people. And it's that way from the Tower of Babel all the way through to the end of Revelation to Babylon the Great. And we see her downfall, of course, pictured and prophesied in Revelation 17 and 18. So here we have Babylon, the one who would be God. And then we go to Jerusalem. What is Jerusalem? Where do we first come across Jerusalem? You remember Melchizedek? Remember Melchizedek? Who was the king and the priest of Salem. Jerusalem. Melchizedek, of course, was a forerunner and a symbol of Christ himself. And Hebrews tells us that very clearly. Christ was the high priest, the great high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Jerusalem is the city that's God's own city. Jerusalem. Oh. Today, a lot of people have their eyes focused on Jerusalem, especially people who are called Zionists. And I want you to know that I am a Zionist, but I am a new Zionist. And the Jerusalem that I want to be a part of is pictured in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, and verse 22. Hebrews 12:22. He says, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem." But notice, he doesn't stop there. "To an innumerable company of angels," then notice this, "to the general assembly and church of the firstborn." So what does Jerusalem represent? And what is the ultimate understanding of Jerusalem? It is the city where God's people are. It represents God's people, the church of the firstborn. And isn't it interesting that when the New Jerusalem comes down, who's in it? All of the saints of God are in the New Jerusalem. And it's all of God's people and God himself. Remember, in the city of Jerusalem, when the final battle is waged and Satan, who used to be Lucifer, has all the wicked surround the great city and try to destroy it. And of course, this great cosmic conflict finally comes to an end. Aren't we yearning for that day? It'll be a bittersweet day, I believe, not only for us, but especially so for God. When he finally has to bring down the ultimate judgment and grant to those who have chosen the other way the desires of their heart to be separate from him. Who is the life giver? And separation from the life giver is what? Death. So here now, as we open Daniel chapter 1, we see this great cosmic conflict, though it doesn't become obvious unless we understand biblical history front to back. If we do, we recognize that in this conflict here pictured is more than just Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim. Ultimately, it is Satan and it is Christ. It is the followers of evil and the saints of God, the people of God, the church of God. So where are we in history as this takes place? Remember, this takes place in 605 BC. Nebuchadnezzar, the crown prince, has come over from Babylon with his huge Babylonian army. He has really come over to conquer and subjugate and defeat Necho, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he does so in the Battle of Carchemish in 605. He does that. He stated purpose. He defeats the Egyptians. And now he's going to take care of some of their weaker allies. And so he searches through the province of Judah. And he comes up to the city of Jerusalem and surrounds it. We don't know exactly what all he did at Jerusalem during this time. He doesn't take the whole city. We know that because there are 2 more trips he takes to Jerusalem before finally Jerusalem is destroyed and the temple is leveled. But it'll take about 20 years for that to all occur. But this time, we know he at least takes the temple area because he takes all of the vessels from the temple, or at least a lot of them. Didn't say all, did it? We know he didn't get the Ark of the Covenant. I think we're pretty certain about that. But he took many. We know he got the candlestick because that appears later in the story of Daniel. And he takes these vessels from God's own temple. It's interesting that this is repeated in the book of Daniel 3 times. And you'll find the next 2 repetitions that talk about that in a chapter 5, that deals with a king named Belshazzar. But we won't get into that story today. This idea of taking the vessels of the temple is a big thing, because in Nebuchadnezzar's mind and in the society's mind in just about every nation on earth, the God who conquers the other God is the ascendant God. He's the powerful God. So it would suggest that the gods of Babylon are more powerful than the great God of heaven. What does that tell you about God's willingness to sacrifice himself for us? He was willing to allow his reputation, his name to be dragged through the mud as some kind of little weakling in order to save a remnant of his people. Because what it looks like here is, when we just read verses 1 and 2, it looks like now the last vestige of people who share the good news about God in this world have just been destroyed and deported to a foreign nation. And we're going to see that even when it looks that way, God is still with his people. Throughout this book, there is a contest taking place, and it's the contest between anything besides God and God. Whatever you might set up in God's place is inferior to God. And we find that in the book of Daniel. Even the greatest gods that the world can throw are impotent when it comes to being compared with God. It looks as if Jerusalem has been replaced by Babylon. It looks as if the worship of the true God is being replaced by the worship of the Babylonian gods. In particular, God Nebuchadnezzar, because the king was considered divine in Babylon. All right, now let's read on. Oh, let me mention one more thing before we read on. Did you notice that to top it all off, the wording tells us in chapter 2 that the Lord gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. So it's God's own action that allows this to take place. And that might bother us a little. But I think our questions will be answered as we get through Daniel. Let's read now verses 3 through 5. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs. And as we read that term, by the way, it has two meanings. The literal, more specific meaning, of course, of a male that has lost his maleness by artificial means. And the other being a little broader term, meaning a court official. There's a lot of discussion about what that is in the book of Daniel. And I don't claim to have the final answer on it. And I don't think it's a big issue, to be honest with you. It was a big issue to them, of course. But I don't think it affects our salvation to know the answer to that. Okay? In any event, we know that there was a lot of very negative things that happened to the people who were taken from Jerusalem. Let's read about it. The king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of his nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Does the King James say stand before the king? Thought it did. It's a technical term, kind of. Actually, it's a term. It gives us another understanding that this is more than just some kind of social issue. The term stand before the king is used in Chronicles talking about the priest standing before God and serving him and ministering for him in the temple. So the term here would give an illusion in biblical language that this is more than just political service. They are being prepared to be a part of the whole religious system of Babylon. Right? Now, let's go back. These young men. Young men. Probably, it seems, because of the qualifications here, they're probably between 16 and 18 years of age. Young men, just ready to enter into a university situation. Young men who look good. Daniel must have been handsome. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Well, we haven't gone into that yet, have we? But these young men must have been handsome, whoever they were. They had to be physically able. There's some allusions here to strength, physical strength, as we look at the description. So they were physically capable. They were physically attractive. They were mentally alert and intelligent. And there's some allusions here to the fact that they were under control of themselves. In other words, they were well-mannered and well-behaved young men. Those are the kind of men that I'd like to look for if I was an employer. What about you? They'd be assets to any business. And Nebuchadnezzar is very specific in what kind of people he wants here. But what's the stated purpose? They want to serve in the king's palace, and they need to learn the language and literature of the Chaldeans. The curriculum then must have included some language. In fact, most likely it included 3 languages. These men already knew Hebrew. They didn't need to learn that. They could learn a related language, which was written with basically the same characters, the same letters as Hebrew. That was Aramaic. And that was the language of business and government in their day. But if they wanted to serve in the temples, And in the sacred precincts, which that was the purpose of the Babylonians' training, one of the purposes, they had to also learn Sumerian, a traditional sacred tongue written in cuneiform. Some of you may have seen some pictures of cuneiform where you took a stylus and you make little triangular shaped shapes in certain patterns. And that's one of the languages they probably had to learn. They probably had to learn Babylonian itself, which is also sometimes called Akkadian, another cuneiform type of language that was more the national dialect of the area. So they were multilingual, I'm sure. These young men probably, in my estimation, knew at least 4 languages by the time they got through with their training. Does that give you a little insight? They were intelligent young men. All of them had to be. They had to be able to catch things pretty well. They had to master the techniques of the Chaldeans. This is a technical term, this Chaldean term, especially in Daniel here. And it's kind of the art of constructing astronomical maps and being able to draw conclusions for the future in particular from those. Now, one of the things they did, we know that they had the ability to forecast solar eclipses. They had the ability to, they not only kept track of them, but they learned to forecast upcoming eclipses. And they successfully did so, and it's recorded. They recorded one that was in 747 BC that took place. But their real goal was not just to predict eclipses. Their real goal was to learn so much of the astronomical bodies that they could actually do the work of astrology that goes back and has its roots in ancient Babylon, where we begin to understand the things about our personal lives by studying the stars. One of the great deceptions of Satan in this world, and they were thrust into the midst of it and expected to become astrologers, I believe. Now think how that would be. To take maybe a young man who was going to the university, one of the universities we took an offering for today, and thrust them into some university to learn to become an astrologer. Take somebody from Andrews University and the seminary and thrust them into university to become an astrologer. You know, there would be some conflicts, don't you think? Some conflicts of conscience. When we look at this very carefully, this whole thing smacks of a change of basic personal viewpoints and religion. Remember, the northern tribes of Israel had been deported some 90, well, more than that. It was in 722 BC. They had been deported into Assyria. And they had been assimilated among the Assyrian populations, and we basically have lost track of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel. And that was, in a sense, I think Nebuchadnezzar's goal was to bring the Jewish people and scatter them out, because later, remember, he came back and got the whole population, basically the whole population, and took them all to Babylon. And if he could re-educate them all, here he's re-educating some of their own to become leaders to help in that influence and help them kind of assimilate into a new culture and a new belief system. In particular, loyalty and worship of the king. Now, let's, I guess we see the diet here mentioned, don't we? In verse 5, notice the training of Babylon touched upon the most basic aspects of life. And in their training, not only are they learning science and literature and languages, they are learning what to eat and how to act, what to do day by day, how to present themselves in court, all these kinds of things. They're learning all these little details. And one of the things that happens is they get the king's menu. And the word used when he says that they give him the menu, it says the king appointed for them a daily provision. The word there used, as you look it up through the Bible, there's only one context in which that word is used elsewhere. And that is where God himself is appointing something. and it's used in the book of Jonah. When God appoints for Jonah, remember? Do you remember some of the stories about that? God appointed a fish. Remember that? And remember at the end of the book of Jonah, God appointed a vine to grow up over Jonah and protect him from the sun? That's the context in which it's used. And now the king appoints. The king appoints as God appoints. So meat and wine. This actually is more than just eating a meal. It seems like actually, as they eat this food that's presented to them from the king's table appointed by the king, in essence, they are giving homage. They are giving worship. They are giving honor to the king in their eating of the food that's given to them. One of the things I think we as Seventh-day Adventists sometimes do, because of our desire to help people have healthful lives, I think we minimize the issues before Daniel and his friends. We limit it to vegetarian versus non-vegetarian diet or something. That's in there. It is a vegetarian diet that they choose later on, and we'll talk about that. But really, the big issue is, to whom do we give our service? To whom do we worship? That's the issue here. And the issue of worship goes all the way from beginning to end of the Scriptures. You remember the first murder took place at the gates of Eden because of the issue of worship. And the last issue in the great controversy here on earth that causes people to either receive a mark or a seal is over the issue of worship. Worship is a big deal in our lives. Whom do we worship? You see, they're getting ready to stand before the king here. Let's look at verse 6 and 7. Now among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Wow, new names. What are these names about? Daniel, God is judge, becomes Belteshazzar. May Bel preserve my life, or his life. Bel, by the way, is the major god of Babylon. It's another name for Marduk, if some of you read Babylonian history. Hananiah, grace of God. Oh, nice name, isn't it? To Shadrach, the order of Aku, a Sumerian moon god. Mishael, who is like God. Meshach, who is like Aku, the Sumerian moon god. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. Abednego, servant of Nego, a form of Nabu, the god of wisdom in Babylon. What's happening here? It's really clear, isn't it? Really clear. Their purpose is to enter into the very hearts and psyches and the very morality of these young men and get them to accept the worship of the Babylonians. Some of you who were in the senior Sabbath school this morning and saw the video may remember that some of those issues happened in Egypt as well. I liked that. I enjoyed watching that. All right, verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart. Purposed in his heart. Oh, I like that. He resolved, didn't he? He resolved something. By the way, do you know what that little word is? That little verb, resolved or purpose? It's one that's kind of near to my heart. It's Sam, S-A-M. And it's a word that's used elsewhere in this same chapter, by the way. In verse 7, where it says the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He resolved that those names would be. He determined that they would be. In other words, the word used here by Daniel, the chief of the eunuchs resolved something, and Daniel resolved something in opposition to that. It's a direct response to what's just been decreed for them. Daniel has a moral response. You see, Daniel understands something. Let's read it and then I'll show you what Daniel understands. Verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed you food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. I have to stop there and just tell you a little story. My dad and I had a good friendship and a good working relationship most of the time. He was a bricklayer and I was his hod carrier. But there was one thing that my dad did not approve of in my life, especially when it began to affect my little sister. And that was that I chose to no longer eat flesh foods, become a vegetarian. And I was 16. And my dad was sure that I was going to dry up and blow away. And his concern for me was out of a heart of love as my dad. He had learned that you could not be strong and really be a man and a bricklayer unless you had a good red steak once in a while. And then my little sister, Linda, to top it off, she comes home one day, and we're sitting at the kitchen table, and I guess there must have been some meat on the table, and my sister bypassed it, and Dad questioned her. He says, well, I don't eat that anymore. He got a little upset because she was skin and bones already. A good wind would blow her away. You know my sister, Linda. And in those days, she was really thin. We were worried about her health because she was so thin. And my dad was just sure that this was going to be her undoing physically. So when I read this about Ashpenaz and the leaders here, they're worried about, they're really worried about Daniel. See, they're worried that Daniel's, but not because of Daniel. They're worried about what will happen to them from the king because of what happens to Daniel and his friends. And they're just certain that this diet that they're looking at, they're asking for, will be negative. So 11. So Daniel said to the steward with whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. The word there, vegetables, or pulse, as is in the King James, it's a word that means seed, actually, or any kind of food that comes from a seed. So basically it would include fruits, grains, nuts, and possibly vegetables as well. It's basically non-flesh diet. All right? That's the term. So, let our countenances be examined before you, verse 13, and the countenances of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenance appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of the delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Now, I want you to think about some of the issues involved. A good Jewish young man of that day knew that rich foods weren't good for them, just like a good Seventh-day Adventist young person in our day knows that real rich foods are not good for you. Don't you know that? I think most of us know that. So there is a health element here. Also, they had no idea how that flesh food was taken care of. It was very likely not kosher. And so it was not slaughtered and prepared in the way that God had given directions for even clean meats to be taken care of. And besides that, I'm sure there were some foods that were in what we would call the unclean category. So there are quite a few issues here. And of course, not to be forgotten is the issue of the fact that most of these foods were probably dedicated to the worship of either an idol or of the king himself. So you have quite a few elements going on here. And so to cut through it all, with one fell swoop, Daniel just requests, let us just have plain vegetables. Let us have plain vegetarian food, simple diet with just water to drink. He knew, of course, that the Lord had given instructions that the priests were not to drink any alcoholic beverages because they would lose their abilities to distinguish between sacred and the non-sacred. And that had been a specific instruction for the priests who served in the temple. And I think Daniel also knew, let's just look at it. Well, keep your finger in Daniel, but go with me to Proverbs chapter 23. I just have to read this one bit of Proverbs that some of us maybe bypass once in a while. Proverbs 23, verses 1, 2, and 3. When you sit down to eat with a ruler. We're here in the court then. So Proverbs gives us some instruction when we're taken to the court of a ruler. Consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are a man given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. Was this written before or after the days of Daniel? Well before. And Daniel had been educated in the book of Proverbs, I am sure of that. So he asked for a specific menu, doesn't he? Some of the words used there, we can't get into all of that because our time is kind of flying by. He uses words that are technical to the creation account, that are similar to the terminology that God uses when he talks about things there, and also technical terms that bring back the whole idea of Leviticus 11, where God gives the instructions between clean and unclean foods. Some of the terms there are similar. Now, let's read some more in Daniel and see if we can wrap it up. Verse 17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. King interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. So the God who gave the temple and its utensils to Nebuchadnezzar to be carried off to the house of his God now gives the people who are taken captive as a result of all that, he gives them what they need in that strange and foreign and very challenging setting. And the grace of God is still at work with his people in the midst of sin and devastation. He gives them intelligence. No, I know the diet was good for them. But I don't think what happened to them was just a result of the diet. I believe it helped them. We have cause and effect. It helped them be strong and healthy and helped them be clear-minded. But do you think it helped Daniel learn to understand visions and dreams? No. God blessed them and God honored them because they were loyal. And because in the situation they were in, the setting they were in, they needed the grace of God. And so God gives them. The scriptures tell me that God gave them the skill and the knowledge. And I think we need to be careful about diluting the grace of God and thinking that somehow if we do all the right actions, that now we can be pretty good people. You see, I can eat all the clean foods I want. I can leave off all the unclean things I want. I can avoid every little thing with any kind of an animal product in it, and I'm still filthy. Because I am born into a world of sin, and I have been infected by the disease of sin, and all of my righteousness, everything I can work up is filthy rags. I have been taken captive to Babylon. You have too. We are in the midst of the enemy of God in this world. And he might help us to understand some details about how to live, because I believe that God wants to tell us all the small things of life so we can gain every blessing we can gain in this life. But you know, the essential ingredient that I have to have and that you have to have is the grace of God. We have to have the gift of God. Grace touches our lives. We must have his ability. As we were talking about the grace of God and the touch of God, I was thinking here of something I read by Jacques Ducan in his book on Daniel. Just a couple little sentences. He said, "Society often judges the person of faith as intellectually weak. Science does not easily accommodate itself with simplistic biblical explanations. On the other hand, we often expect health and beauty among people of little brain power. One has difficulty imagining a man with pumped up muscles, deep in thought, or involved in spiritual meditation. Daniel teaches us, however, that intelligence, physical development do not clash. The harmonious reunion of all the faculties is an ideal we need to seek." You see, God wants to give us grace that touches the whole being. And Daniel shows that we cannot divide our life into little compartments and be spiritual here but not worry about what it is we put in our mouths. So even the little things of life. Isn't it interesting how the great challenge in Eden revolved around appetite? Isn't it interesting when Jesus began his ministry, he went out in the wilderness and the first temptation Satan threw at him? Appetite. Is it interesting when Daniel gets into the courts of Babylon, the big issue he first faces is appetite. You see, the smallest parts of our lives and our response to those will help to determine where we end up in the great cosmic conflict we sometimes call the great controversy. The last verse. "Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus." Cyrus, I heard. Here in King Cyrus, we have an allusion to the ultimate victory of God. We have the one who was the king on earth that was foretold by the prophet Isaiah by name way before he was born, that he would come and save God's people. But we also have in Cyrus a foretelling, a symbol, a shadow of the great deliverer, the great Savior, the Messiah himself to come. Which would suggest here in this very first chapter, you see, the first chapter of Daniel is the setting for the whole book, as the first two verses are the setting for the chapter. And so now we see that it's not just victory in Babylon, but it's really a foretelling of victory for all of God's people, including you and me. We may find ourselves taken captive, and we may be in the midst of Babylon today. Because in this old world, we are under a foreign ruler. The prince of this world is trying to take over. But if we're faithful in the midst of that to what we know to be right, and we put our faith and our trust in the God that we learned about, He will prepare us. He will give us the grace that we need. And He will give us the victory in the end.